This evening, I was working DoorDash. Since it was my full-time job, I typically made an effort to work 8 or 9 hours a day. To be honest, I had trouble sticking to a schedule. I would put off starting until later and later into the night every day. Sometimes it doesn't even begin until 9 or 10 p.m. It was one of those evenings. This order arrived about 1 a.m. after I had been working for 3 hours. It was a pickup grocery order from a convenience store near the fueling station. I pulled up to the deserted petrol station and entered. The cashier was the only person present, and it was quiet. I made sure it was the correct thing when I got back in the car. One big, inexpensive bottle of wine. Undoubtedly an intriguing order, but it's also more inconvenient for me. I've always liked to simply drive up and leave everything on the doorstep without talking to anyone. However, I would have to wait for them to respond, since I had to verify their ID when they were intoxicated. In any case, I got behind the wheel. The distance in the woods was little more than 15 minutes. This was nothing unusual, because the majority of the town was covered in forests. However, it was really rough and hard to drag down their driveway. It didn't appear to be in good condition. After that, I arrived to the residence. It was a single, ancient house standing by itself. I could only see the front of the home with my headlights shining on it, because it didn't appear that any lights were on. After parking, I exited. There was silence in the woods. Every sound I made seemed to be the only sound in the room, giving me the impression that I was by alone. However, it was 1 a.m. I got up. I made sure I had everything ready for the ID check and everything by pulling up the order on my phone next to my car. I saw a light in the woods when I was there. However, I didn't give it much thought because it appeared to be a light from someone else's home, such as a porch light. However, I was unable to see the house itself. The light was barely visible since it was too far away. Among all the trees, I went up to the porch after setting up the app. I banged on the door as I couldn't find a doorbell. The knock reverberated throughout the house, just like it would in a vacant house. It was a little strange, but once more, I chose to ignore it and wait for a response. Up until now, the only thing that seemed strange to me was that there were no lights on in the house or on the porch. Nevertheless, my headlights beaming on the front of the home were the sole source of light that let me see. I know it seems weird, but I didn't find the older house in the woods to be really unsettling. I waited for a solid minute before hearing something coming from the door, and it opened in an instant. I saw how dark the interior was as soon as the door opened. I had assumed that there might be some dim lighting in the rear of the building, or that they might switch on the lights as they approached to answer the door. But I was mistaken. It was nearly completely dark inside. The man standing at the doorway was scarcely visible to me. He was quite skinny and taller than average, and his face was mostly hidden by darkness. I explained that I only wanted to quickly check his ID for alcohol. He nodded, and I believe he grinned a little, but my vision was blurry. He asked me to wait so he could get his wallet. He spoke in a grating, slow voice. The man turned around and headed down the hall to the opposite end of the home, leaving the door open, only a few feet away from the threshold, vanishing into the emptiness of darkness. I felt uneasy now. I mean, I was kind of already, but it was incredibly weird to realize that the man lived in a completely dark house. I believe that as my anxiety increased, I started to look about more anxiously. I turned to face my car, which was parked menacingly in the gravel driveway with its headlights on, and only the dark woods behind it. My gaze then strayed to the nearby woodland. The light I had seen in the woods caught my attention once more, but this time I was closer. After a few seconds of staring at it, I realized it was moving. It was only slightly moving or shaking, like if someone was standing motionless and pointing a flashlight in my direction. It wasn't glowing all around. A shiver ran down my spine. The lights had to be within 50 feet of the trees. Outside, however, it remained utterly silent. I was unable to hear anything or anyone. However, I was staring at it when I heard a noise coming from within the home. I moved my gaze back through the doorway and peered through the front hall's darkness. These soft creaks on the flooring sounded like someone was carefully approaching the doorway. I bolted for my automobile after leaping off the porch. The light in the woods shifted as I did, but I didn't stare long enough to see what they were doing. Still recovering my breath, I climbed in and drove off. I returned to the road and parked at the same gas station in an attempt to gather my thoughts. It's peculiar how under circumstances in a situation like this, the mind makes a great effort to quickly realize that it wasn't what it appeared to be. I was too distracted to keep working, but I truly couldn't figure out what it was. After that, I returned home and ended the evening. I finally performed some research after thinking about it non-stop for a few days, not so much to figure out what went wrong as to convince myself that there was nothing to be concerned about, but I soon discovered some unsettling facts. The house was deserted. That tract of wooded land had been empty for more than 50 years, or at least it was meant to be. It was surrounded by no houses at all. I have no idea what was going to happen that evening, but I feel like I barely survived. I went to my older brother's cottage in 2019 to keep an eye on his dog while he was abroad. He didn't want to leave his dog, Cooper, with a stranger on his brief 3-day work trip. Although I refer to my brother's house as a cabin, it was actually a typical, moderately sized house. It was tucked away in the middle of the woods, which is the only reason I called it a cabin. Before my brother left that afternoon at around 3, I spent the first day hanging around and catching up with him. There, other than unwinding and perhaps listening to music by the fireplace, there wasn't much to do in his cabin. I thought it would be lovely to sit outside by a campfire and watch the sunset after dinner. As the sun gradually sank below the trees, Cooper and I relaxed in the yard by the campfire. At least for the first hour, it was quite pleasant. But as soon as the sun set, I discovered that it was not quite as peaceful. In fact, it was rather unsettling. The calm of the woods was unsettling, and everything surrounding the cottage went utterly dark. I extinguished the flame and returned inside within 10 minutes of the sun setting. I genuinely detested the unsettling sensation of being outside at night. Perhaps it was simply not for me. Ironically, I put on a scary movie while Cooper and I sat on the couch, but I was exhausted from the long drive to the cabin, and I slept intermittently throughout the entire movie. But when I woke up one day, Cooper was no longer by my side. I took a seat. He was sitting near the front entrance when I got up and looked around. As I yelled his name, I became aware of how strange it was. Cooper didn't appear to be merely relaxing there. He was looking and gazing at the front entrance, while sitting up straight and facing front. Coop, are you all right? For a little moment, he glanced back at me. Then his gaze returned to the door. I stood up and approached him, giving him a pat on the side and peering through the peephole of the entrance. Nothing caught my eye. I opened it and protruded my head. Nothing appeared to be out there, but it was still too dark to see well. There were also no animal sounds coming from the area. I thought a deer or whatever must have gone by a few minutes ago, so I shut the door and returned to Cooper. It's perhaps appropriate to note that Coop was a young German Shepherd mix and was undoubtedly intelligent. I had no doubt that he had heard or smelled something, but I assumed it had to be a harmless animal straying close to the cottage. I quickly went to bed after finishing the film. I took Cooper outdoors in the morning and spent the majority of the day enjoying my coffee and lounging outside. I tried going for a walk, but I was afraid of getting lost in the forest, so I was reluctant to venture too far. I simply kept close to the cabin. I hurried back inside to avoid the darkness when the sun finally set, and I essentially repeated what I had done the night before. I switched on a movie while lying on the couch. After spending some time lying with me, Cooper ended up exploring the rest of the home to kill time. But suddenly, from behind me, I could hear his deep, booming barking. I leapt to my feet and ran into the kitchen, shouting his name. Cooper was barking violently at what appeared to be nothing at all, while standing with his tail between his knees and hair rising up on his back. Even after I managed to calm him down, I couldn't stop him from continuing this deep, low growl to stop barking. I didn't know what had happened or what had frightened him. The kitchen was empty. Above the counters, there was only one window, but it was too high for Coop to look out of. In an attempt to calm Cooper down, I reassured him that everything was fine. I then allowed him to join me on the couch in the living room. I seemed to be able to calm him down for a brief while before there was an abrupt, hollow tapping sound, returning from the kitchen, where we had just been. Naturally, this caused Coop to bark once more, but since I was genuinely rather alarmed, I didn't tell him to stop this time. I stood up and returned to the kitchen. There was nothing. The sound I heard was similar to the hollow thump of someone rapping on a window's exterior. Naturally, I approached the kitchen window and peered out. Really, there was nothing to look at. At this moment, I had no idea what to think. Was I simply unaccustomed to the sounds of being in a cabin in a forest? Or was it a raccoon or something else attempting to get in? The most concerning thing to me was that Cooper appeared tense as well. I mean, why was he freaking out so badly if these were simply typical sounds? However, it was becoming rather late, and I reasoned that perhaps going to the bedroom would help us cool off. I watched the movie in bed, because there was a tiny TV there as well. Coop took a seat beside me. The rest of the night, keep your ears open and pay attention. I started getting ready for bed at around 11 p.m. turning out all the lights in the cabin. I let Cooper sleep in the room with me. So I shut the door, filled his water dish, and took a shower to clean up before going to bed. I was still having fun at the cabin, despite a few odd incidents, and I was eager to go to bed and wake up to spend my final day there. However, while I was washing, I abruptly shut off the water, threw on my clothes, and hurried out into the room when I heard a couple thumps on the wall and Cooper barking once again. The bedroom door was now open, and Cooper was nowhere to be found. Although Coop was intelligent, it appeared impossible to unlock doors. As he moved more into the cabin, I could hear his barks. I saw the front door was open as soon as I dashed into the corridor and down to the other end. Cooper was running and barking, so I didn't even have time to think. Into the woods, far from the cabin, he was gone in a matter of seconds. As he grew farther away, all I could hear were the faint sounds of his barking. I ran after him after grabbing a flashlight from the front closet. It seemed as though Coop's barking stopped as soon as I was in the midst of a forest, with only trees around me. I stood motionless and sort of froze when I discovered that there was only a slight breeze rustling the branches above me, and the forest was nearly peaceful. Cooper, Coop, Cooper. I repeatedly yelled Cooper's name in the hopes that he would abandon the person he was pursuing and simply return to me. Before I heard leaves stirring in front of me, I must have been out there for 5 terrifying minutes. A moment later, Coop ran toward me with his tail tucked in and a terrified expression on his face. He was staring back at the darkness from which he had just emerged, and I could hear him whimpering softly. I ran back, making sure he followed, in the direction of the cabin, and led us back inside. While I waited for aid to arrive, I called 911. And then my brother. After that, we spent the night at a hotel till my brother returned the next day. Sadly, not much was done to follow up. There was undoubtedly someone prowling the cabin. At least during the several days I was there, someone had broken in, but Coop chased them out once they got to the bedroom. What transpired while Cooper was by himself in the pitch-black forest, I'm not sure, but poor Coop seemed to be scared for weeks following that. Fortunately, though, he appeared to get better. That was undoubtedly the most terrifying and intense thing I have ever experienced, and I'm not sure if I would be here now if Cooper hadn't chased them away. Since then, more than 6 years have passed, and Coop is now approaching 10 years old. Every time I go to see my brother, I still enjoy seeing him. I still adore him, and I am grateful for what he did for me that night at the cabin, and for protecting my brother from whoever is still out there, even though he is not my dog. After a demanding afternoon at work, I was on my way home. It was getting close to midnight. Since it takes an hour and a half to go to the city, I typically take the train, but I knew I would be staying late this evening, past the rail's operating hours. I was quite exhausted due to the lengthy workday and the fact that it was already 2 hours past when I'd typically be asleep. It was much more exhausting and difficult to stay awake. after I left the city and drove on the long, straight, deserted rural roads. It felt almost like agony to have to stay awake while driving, but I didn't feel like I was in danger of falling asleep. I drove down what seemed like an unending road for 40 minutes, seeing just 4 or 5 automobiles before I noticed anything on the side of the road. A pickup truck was parked on the grassy shoulder, but there were no lights on and no indications that anyone was inside or around. Strange for being in the middle of nowhere, but it's likely that you simply ran out of petrol or had some auto issues and had to take an Uber home. I didn't give it much thought until I passed another less than 2 minutes later. It was a vehicle, but nearly identical, parked off the side of the road on the grass close to the woods, with nobody in sight. I'd walked this route many times before and had never seen anything like it, so it had to be a coincidence. It kept me slightly awake, keeping my eyes off the road in search of anything more fascinating. I would say a few more minutes went by. I was staring at the street when abruptly I saw something on the pavement in front of me in my headlights. There was not even time to swerve out of the road or see what it was. I struck it with my right tire right away. For a little minute, I was rather taken aback by how unexpected it was. I continued to drive while listening for any problems with my car, hoping that I had simply run it over seamlessly, but a minute later, I realized something wasn't right. I could see it was going flat without even waiting for the tire pressure symbol to illuminate. When I pulled over to the side of the road, I immediately saw how much more coincidental this was in comparison to the 2 cars I had observed before. The sole distinction was that they weren't, but I was still in my car. After putting it in park and taking a big breath, I got out to examine the damage. I was exhausted. I was so disappointed and outraged that this had happened on a night like today that I didn't even have the energy to be angry. I moved to my car's side and examined the tire. The tire was nearly completely flattened, and there were obvious scratches on the paint surrounding the wheel. I definitely needed a ride home and a tow truck. I couldn't help but take in my surroundings before I got back in my car. I was on the side of a long, deserted road between towns with just trees in all directions. Being out there by myself and stranded felt a little unsettling. I noticed something different just as those emotions began to overwhelm me. Someone was approaching me from far down the road. Naturally, the darkness made it difficult for me to see them, but the fact that they were strolling on the edge of the tree line on the side of the road made it even more difficult. They appeared to be attempting to avoid being noticed by staying off the road. I initially assumed it might be one of the people from the other cars I'd passed, but as they approached, this unpleasant feeling destroyed me. I called for a tow truck as soon as I got back in the car. After a minute or two, the man was approaching and was ready to go by when they left the tree line and began going up to the road through the grass. They approached the side directly of my vehicle. As they approached the window, I observed them. They were obviously nervous and, I suppose, unstable, but they said nothing. Reading them or what they were doing was really difficult, but after a few moments, he fixed his gaze on me. His stare was so unsettling that I felt the want to get out of there. I shifted into drive and headed out. My intuition told me that there was something seriously wrong with that individual. Even though I knew I ran the risk of breaking my wheel, I passed another car after only 20 seconds on the road, but this one was not like the others. The interior lights were on, and the door was halfway open. The man appeared to have come from that direction. I continued. I stopped and received assistance with my car at the closest town. I would never truly know what that guy wanted, or even what happened, so I simply thought it was a really weird experience. I had largely forgotten about it once everything was resolved. That is, until I heard 4 days later, recounted a troubling incident in which the persons vanished from the road I frequently used to get to and from work. I promptly checked into it after thinking about the 2 abandoned cars I'd spotted that evening. When I realized it was the same night, my body went numb. Additionally, those 2 vehicles belonged to the 2 individuals that went missing. Both vehicles had tire damage from colliding with an object in the road that was probably placed there on purpose to leave them stranded. I gave the police information over the phone, But as of right now, neither of the missing individuals has been located. To the best of my knowledge, there hasn't even been a hint as to who was responsible or what they did to them. The thought of how close I was